We have our very first keynote of the day, Dune Lankard, who's the president and founder of the Native Conservancy. I'm not sure if we've got, well, I think the bio is in the folder there for him. Along with that, he's busy. He's doing a lot of different things, so many different foundations, and pretty much anything that's going to help the Alaska Native community, fishing community, really dial into ocean health and restoration, farming models to promote healing and restoration work. He's working on things such as the kelp seed nurseries, cold storage, boat, just every angle possible. And we applaud what he does, but the thing that I'm so appreciative of is I got to know him in April to some degree these last couple of years, is how they do it and the heart and passion that they bring, which is something I think that resonates in this room really, really well. So thank you not just for what you do, but for how you do it, and we look forward to your remarks today. Please welcome to the podium, Dune Lankard.
Hi, everyone. In Eyak, it's Ishu, hello, which means, is that you? And it's clear that I don't get out enough because I see a lot of friendly faces and folks that I grew up with that I don't get to see often enough. And there's a saying that the more popular you are away from home, the less popular you are at home. This is true. And we are on Dena'ina land. I always travel around to indigenous people's homelands, and I see how they live and how they make it work, and some of the challenges that they're facing. And I know even here in Anchorage, it's tough to see some of the challenges that indigenous peoples have to go through. But to start off, I didn't sleep so well. It was blowing like it was out on the outside of Montague last night, all night long. So I only got several hours of sleep. And I remember many times being out there crabbing, I was wondering, what am I doing out here? Like, why am I doing this? And, I believed in the fishery. I believed in what the ocean did for my family. And we were fishermen and we were crabbers. And I did what I could, and I lasted 3 years. And I realized that there was a lot more that I wanted to do in life other than float around out in the sea in rough weather, chasing crab. But now I find myself out there on the sea again. But I'd like to thank all the organizers to this event. It's really wonderful to see this many amazing people come together to figure out solutions and answers for some of the challenges that we're facing in this industry. Because as we all know, there's many, many barriers that we're going to have to overcome together in order to make this work for Alaska. So my Eyak name is Jamutsiki, which means the little bird that screams really loud and won't shut up. And so Melissa said I only had an hour. But I received that name shortly after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, because I realized that in order for me to do this work, and especially take on Exxon and help save our forests from being clear-cut, that I found myself having to be louder than everything else, yet remain a voice of reason so people would listen. And so that's how I earned that name. I'm also from the Eagle Clan. And the Eyaks, we migrated out of the interior of Alaska 3,500 years ago. And we came down to the coast, landed near Yakutat. And as the glaciers were receding, a thin green strip of habitat was being formed along the coast. And we migrated from Yakutat to what is now known as Cordova. It used to be called Eyak at one time. And I remember Grandma Lena Ataki, which means strong as an ant in Eyak. Saska, who was my grandmother, always had a group of people with recorders, and they were documenting everything she would be saying, except when she would be cussing at them in Eyak, because they were documenting the Eyak language, Dr. Michael Krause, and that was the language map that you saw. He had actually put that together when he was documenting the native languages in the state. One thing I wanted to share with you about our logo and the diamonds that you see on the top of each of these slides is our Native Conservancy logo is actually a raven and an eagle coming together. And the outer circle is eagle feathers and salmon stripes, and at the very top is an eye. Because what the Eyaks would do is when they would go on a long trip or they'd travel from their longhouse for extended periods of times, they would have these eyes on their boxes, which would have their hunting stuff, their cooking stuff, clothing, furs, whatever, and the eye would watch over their stuff. And so even like the totem poles, the Eyaks were one of the furthest northern totem and canoe building tribes. So if you see that eye, that's what it is. It's watching you. It's watching over the ocean and the land. And the red and black diamond motif symbolizes coming together. And I feel that that's what we're doing right now, is coming together to figure out how we're going to get this industry started and this mariculture party started. And even though they are red and black, which is our war colors, we didn't make them that color for that reason. The question that I posed is, what could ocean farming success look like? I wish in that opening slide that it looked like the bull kelp that you see floating around in different places in different regions around Alaska, rather than anchors, lines, and buoys. One day, I'd like to see more direct seeding so we could get away from those intrusive buoys. And because, growing up on the ocean, I remember when I saw the first sailboat enter Prince William Sound, when I saw the first herd of kayaks come into the region, I knew it was over. It was the beginning of the end as we knew it, and that we were discovered, and that more people were coming. And so, I feel like the work that we're having to do together is figure out how we're going to restore the ocean, how we're going to preserve what we have. And one of the lessons that we learned from the Exxon Valdez oil spill was that we had to first restore or preserve what we still had in order to restore what was destroyed. One of the things that my mother Rosie would always teach her 7 little Indians was that she would say, it'll all come out in the wash. And a lot of times when we are out there trying to figure this mariculture stuff out, and some of it's hard. It's some of the hardest work I've ever done. Like a lot of you who are fishermen, we know that like if we want to go and fish a different region, we buy a permit, we buy that boat, we get the net, we go out there and we think like that fish and we go chase it around. But in mariculture, the infrastructure isn't there, so we have to build it from the ground up. And so we're having to figure out, how do we do these business plans? How do we do these landscape analysis? How do we figure out how to source our wild seed? How are we going to grow it and deploy it and monitor it and harvest it? What are we going to do when we pull it from the sea? And in a lot of fisheries, the market already exists. So it's not like in this fishery or this industry that we have the processing and markets figured out yet. But I'm hoping that some of the things that are on these slides that you're going to want to copy to read it more thoroughly, because I know it's kind of wordy, but I wanted to share everything. And so I think that some of the experiences that we're having, we're realizing that some of you have probably already figured out the answers, and we're still working on some of them. But my talk today is about hope and history and a regenerative future. And in order to get to where we want to go, we have to first remember and know where we came from, how we got here. And that's why in one of the slides, I have Alaska's body of law. This is the history as I know it. I was born into statehood. My mother and grandmother taught me the ways of our Eyak people and in the history of Alaska and what we had to endure and what we were going through at that time, which was the land claims. By the time I was 10, I realized that Native people were fighting for their existence. They were fighting for their land claims. There was a number of things that happened in Alaska's body of law that took our finfish away. Limited entry in 1973, 2 years after the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. At the same time, the Bolt decision was being fought out in Washington State, where the Indians ended up with 50% of the fishery resource. That didn't happen for us here. And then with the land claims, we lost 340 million acres out of 380 million. We only retained 11% of our original land base. So growing up in my family, which was very political, my father was a fisherman, so he was trying to get involved in fish politics, and my mother was wrapped up in Native politics. So I heard it all the time. And I learned, most of my education came from the Copper River Delta and Prince William Sound, and from my mother and father learning from them what was really going on in the neighborhood, which I wish they were teaching that in the schools. So we knew what was happening with fish politics and Native politics all the time. But what we're doing is just one of 1,000 regenerative economies that needs to happen and be funded and implemented if we're serious about surviving as a human race, let alone saving the ocean. So I feel like it's important, for you to know and remember that what we're doing is just one or two of those 1,000 blue economy, regenerative economies that needs to be implemented, not only in Alaska, but around the world. And I also want to say that, let's not believe everything we think. Let's also think about creating a healthy co-opetition where we cooperatively compete to carpet the ocean with kelp and save the damn ocean while we can. We are in this together. What's happening in the ocean, what's happening on the land impacts all of us. And it's going to take all of us to figure out how we're going to make it. And I'm worried about what we're going to leave our children and what we're not going to leave our children. I remember growing up, I had opportunities and choices. There was different fisheries, there was different things that I could do. We're having less and less of those for our children now. And I look at my 13-year-old daughter, Ananda, and I tell her sometimes, I am so sorry, honey. I am so sorry. The bad decision, death that we're leaving you with, the environment that we're leaving you with, the ocean that was once plentiful, that we've abused and taken advantage of. I try to tell her that I'm going to do everything in my power to help her figure out how she's going to make it in her life, how she's going to have opportunities and choices as we did. And I'd like to, I had one NOAA thing here is, no. We need a government-to-government consultation process in order to implement these new aquaculture opportunity areas, because I know that they're based on, generating more economy and trying to figure out how we're going to increase food security and expand economic alternatives and opportunities. But the First Nation indigenous peoples need to be consulted. We need to, since there is no coastal zone management plan, come on. In Alaska, This is our only chance. We're the stakeholders. We're the stewards. We're the ones who are the guardians of the waters. And so I really believe that these mariculture and kelp farm opportunities have the opportunity to be the new water keepers of the ocean. You know, if we can start deploying magic buoys, data buoys, that give us the information of what we can grow and where we can grow it and how fast it'll grow, that'll help de-risk this industry, and at the same time it'll help us figure out how to preserve the ocean to the best of our abilities. And April, I'd like to apologize that I'm not following exactly how this slideshow we laid out, but I just, as Robert said, I'm very passionate about what I believe and what I think and what I feel that we need to figure out how we can work together to solve. I remember that when I first started fishing, that when I was a young pup, I used to fish super exclusive areas before they went limited entry. And one of them was I went up to Norton Sound. And so I was looking on the map, and I was a herring fisherman in the Sound. And so I said, well, how hard could this be? So I went to Dillingham, and I looked around for a boat, and I couldn't get a nice boat that I would have liked. But I found a double ender, an old wooden 1964 top-of-the-line double ender that had a lot of holes in it and leaks. So I had to stuff it before I dropped it in the water and hope that the swelling of the wood and the corking would stop the leaking. So I bought a couple of extra roll pumps just in case. And so then I started looking around for a tender, you know, to tow me up to Norton Sound, and I realized that wasn't happening either. And then I realized I didn't have any nets, and I needed at least 3 or 4 nets, a couple different sizes, you know, to chase the herring, and I didn't know anything about the size of their herring. And I just happened to be walking by this locker one day, and this guy goes, Dune Lankard. And I looked and I go, maybe. And he goes, I know you. You're from Cordova. I know your father. Your father invented the Lankard reel. He revolutionized the fishing industry overnight by building this reel because all the fishermen were pulling their nets by hand. I said, yeah, that's me. And, and he said, well, how can I help you? And I said, you know, I'm looking for nets. He goes, what kind? And I said, herring nets. I'm going to Norton Sound. He goes, I make nets. I said, he goes, pick out what sizes. And I said, like how many? He goes, 4 nets, any size. And I said, well, you're going to have to tell me about the sizes because I don't know how big these fish are. And so he gave me the 4 nets, and he said, just pay me when you come back. And I was like, oh, my God, now I have 4 nets and no boat. And so then I went back down to the harbor to see if the boat was floating. I kept it tied up to the grid so it wouldn't sink, just in case it didn't float. And everything looked okay. So I loaded up the nets and filled up the tanks and took off for out of Dillingham. And I'd never been up and fished that fishery ever. And all I had was a Loran Sea and some maps. And so I charted my course and I headed that way. Well, I realized that I didn't know where I was going or how far I had to go and how much fuel and if I had enough to get to where I was going. And I saw, you know, on TV and in pictures, the polar bears and the walruses and the sea ice. And I was like, well, I won't encounter that, will I? And sure enough, you know, on the second, third day, I'm encountering, you know, ice and you know, wildlife like I've never seen before in the Copper River Delta or Prince William Sound. And then the ice started moving, and I was having to, you know, figure out how to steer this wooden boat around these icebergs so they wouldn't puncture the boat, and I'd sink that way. And this big boat saw me trying to figure out how to do this, and it was about a 300-foot tender that was hauling boats up to the Norton Sound fishery. And this guy came over, and he couldn't believe that I was doing this. I said, I can't either. And he goes, I'm going to pull your little boat up and put it on the deck of mine, and I'm going to run you up there, which I was so relieved and happy. And, you know, and so then I got to sit in the skipper's quarters and you know, help him, well, I watched, help them skipper the boat going up to Norton Sound. But what I realized was there was about 20 Pac-Man herring gill netters with beater bars. And I don't know if any of you even know what that means, but you herring fishermen would. It's these reels that have these beater bars that the entire reel shakes. And it shakes all of the herring out of the net onto the deck, and then they go right into the fish bin from there. And I realized that they could pack about 20 ton each. And the fishery that I was going to, all of these native peoples had 1 ton lunds. They had a lund that could pack 1 ton of herring and have 1 string of gear, 1 shackle. And that's how they fished, because they couldn't afford the big boats. They couldn't afford a lot of nets. They didn't have the markets. And so they were in this super exclusive fishery competing against these Pac-Man boats that I realized that I was outnumbered and that they were certainly going to catch more fish no matter what I did. So as soon as I got up there, I took, and I don't recommend this, I took tarps and I stapled them inside of my wooden fish bin. And I figured if I filled it with herring all the time, it would stop the leaks. And I just would have to, make sure that I had at least 6 inches of freeboard and not a lot of waves, not fishing around a lot of waves so I wouldn't get swamped. I ended up deck loading that boat 3 times, but I ended up hooking up those 2 rule pumps underneath the tarp just in case, because I knew that if I sprung a leak, I wasn't going to be able to get to it, but because I would have all the herring on the boat. And so later, when a couple of my fishing buddies had realized what I'd done, they go, "I wouldn't do that again." And I said, "I hear you." But what I realized was the inequities of the fisheries and the mentality, and not having the markets, or not having the money, not having the bigger boats, not having tenders that sit around and wait for you to load your boat. These 1 ton lunds, there was 30, 40 of them tied up behind 1 tender, just waiting to offload. And if they couldn't offload by that 6-hour opener, then that's all they got was that 1 ton. And so I feel like in this fishery, in this mariculture and ocean farming industry, that if we work together, that we can address some of those inequities. Because the bottom line is, if it works for us Native people, it'll work for anyone. It'll help our communities that are witnessing 85% unemployment. It'll help people figure out how to create good, high-paying jobs to bring their youth back to their villages. And I feel like a lot of the work that we're doing, bringing the women and the youth back, the men will follow. How am I doing, April? So what was kind of like the catalyst for me to get into this ocean farming industry was in 2017, only 45,000 sockeye salmon were harvested on the Copper River, where I've lived and made my living my entire life. And we normally catch, if normally is a word anymore, we would normally catch like 1 million to 1.5 million sockeyes. Then in 2018, only 90,000 sockeyes were harvested on the Copper River. And then the following year, the ocean heated up to 76 degrees for 3 weeks down to 20 feet below the surface, where across the state, millions of krill, mussels, wild kelp forests, and then salmon and birds died because they couldn't migrate fast enough. And so what had happened was I realized that this was the change that we knew was inevitable with what was happening to the ocean. And so I sat down with my family and friends and I said, this is not how it ends. This is how it begins. We have to adapt. We have to evolve. We have to change. We have to think differently. We have to be differently. We have to figure out how we're going to grow things from the land and the sea. A dear friend of mine, Dr. Elizabeth Hoover, wrote an article entitled, "How Can You Call Yourself Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself?" To me, that just said it all. Like, okay, we have to figure out how to grow things from the land and the sea. Another dear friend, Michael Bezanson, who was the founder of organic food program for Whole Foods USA, one day he said, "Dune, if it's not regenerative, just don't do it." And I realized that, I had to look at things differently. So I feel like the mariculture industry, like, yes, the carbon sequestration may not be proven yet, or the jury is still out on that. I think there's a lot of variables that we have to take into consideration. But, the reality is that the mariculture industry, being one of those regenerative economies, we should look at this from the ground up, all the way from how our boats are powered using fossil fuels. Let's make electric motors, like what Photon Marine is doing. In one of the slides that April will pull up, and again, I'm sorry, I'm not following the script. But we have to think about electric motors and hybrid and hydrogen and hydrofoils. We have to look at different ways that we build vessels. Like I want to build if I have my way, we'll build a floater processor where we take the waste energy and redirect it into our onboard dehydrators, so we can dry the kelp as we're running the town or we're out there at sea. Once we pull the kelp out of the water, we dehydrate it, and our tenders are taking finished products off to market. And, look at run-of-the-river hydros and wave buoys and different types of green energy, because the communities in remote areas of Alaska are not going to be able to afford to get into this industry if we don't figure out this renewable energy question. And so after the crashes in 2017, 18, and 19, I re-jump-started our Native Conservancy to basically figure out how we could, include food security into all of our work. Because before that, we were just doing LandBack work. We were doing as much preservation of habitat in the spill zone as we possibly could. But I realized that we had to figure out how we were going to get our ocean back and get our rights back to the ocean, and figure out how we can change our relationship with not only the sea, but how our traditional food sources are harvested and processed. And so I wanted to be able to figure out how to get into this new economy, but figure out how to do this on our own. So we take all of these barriers to entry, and we try and come up with solutions. And I remember early on, April said, it's all a test. Every mistake we make is an opportunity to learn something. And that's where wisdom comes from. Wisdom is created from not only success, but the mistakes that we make in order to not duplicate them again in the future. So working together, we're going to be able to duplicate those successes rather than the many mistakes that we seem to make in this industry or any new fishery. So when I think about, like what, we're doing in this industry, I think preserving the wild kelp forest is critical because that's the mother seed of this new mariculture industry that we're creating. And climate change will impact everything. And so already wild kelp forests are disappearing around the world. So we're going to have to think about kelp banking, banking that mother seed. Where is that going to be? How are we going to do that? Our nurseries and our hatcheries that we're building and that we need to build across the state to grow this industry, they're going to have to double as laboratories. So we're learning how to grow climate change resilient species for the future, because we're going to need it all. We're going to have to figure out how we can do this, because I truly believe kelp can help. I think that if we're able to make a couple hundred or more food products and biofuels and bioplastics and compost and fertilizer and pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals. I mean, kelp is the hemp of the sea. It's this miracle organism that can grow 18 to 24 inches a day under ideal conditions. So when we started out, I told my crew, I said, one day we're going to get paid to watch kelp grow. We're not there yet. How am I doing? 3 minutes? Okay, wrap up. Okay, I completely blew this. So in closing, I would just like to share this, is that because of what's happened in Alaska's history and what's happened to my Eyak people and losing our land and our sovereignty and our way of life and our tribal government and everything, and then when the spill happened and I realized no one was coming, I knew that I had to become this warrior Dune, and I had to take on the powers that be. And I had to figure out how we were going to preserve what we still had and help restore what had been destroyed. But I also realized that being a defender of Mother Earth, that's one part of who I am. You know, I'm still, you know, Daddy Dune to my 13-year-old daughter, Ananda. You know, Ananda's a dog sledder. She's a basketball star. She's a volleyball star. She runs track and field. She's a downhill skier in the diamond runs, which is terrifying for Dad. She's a horse jumper, and has 17 dogs. And everything I do is for her. And everything I do is for you, is for us, because I want us to figure out how we're going to change things before it's too late. And I feel like, you know, we're all in this together. And like I need you, you need me. We can do this together. We can bring in new money and foundations and support. And you know, the work that the SEC has done so far is just short of miraculous. And, you know, when I feel like, you know, with the current administration, we have an opportunity to really figure out how to get this new ocean farming industry off the ground in the right way, in a good way that works for us all. And I'm in. Are you? Thank you.
Well, the next panel comes up. I just say the presentation is informative, but Dune's heart is what's inspiring, and really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues are doing. It's meaningful, and you all know what hard work you have ahead of you, but trailblazers like this makes it just a little less hard. You're going to say, well, I'm not dodging crazy icebergs out there in a small dinghy.